When Michael Jordan walked through the doors of the White House that autumn day, he carried something in his briefcase that would change everything. The President of the United States stood waiting in the Oval Office, smiling and ready to shake hands. But what Jordan was about to say would wipe that smile away and leave the most powerful man in America standing there, unable to speak. This wasn't about basketball. This wasn't about fame or money. This was about a 7-year-old boy named Raymond who asked Jordan one simple question in a letter, a question so honest and so powerful that it forced Jordan to see the truth about America. And now, Jordan was going to make the president see it too. What he revealed in that room would shake the White House to its core, but you won't believe what it was until the very end. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Rose Garden as Michael Jordan stepped through the heavy doors of the White House, his presence commanding attention, even in a place designed to humble. Secret Service agents nodded respectfully, their stoic expressions betraying nothing, but their eyes revealed something deeper: admiration, perhaps even awe. This wasn't Jordan's first visit to this historic building, but today felt different. The weight of what he carried in his briefcase pressed against his ribs like a stone, and the words he planned to speak had been rehearsing themselves in his mind for 3 sleepless nights. President Marcus Chen stood waiting in the Oval Office, his silver-streaked hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the famous windows. He extended his hand with a practiced smile. But Jordan could see the curiosity dancing in the president's dark eyes. They had met before at various ceremonies and state functions, exchanged pleasantries about basketball and policy. But this meeting had been requested by Jordan himself, marked urgent on the president's calendar. What transpired in the next 30 minutes would leave Chen standing speechless, gripping the edge of his desk, his carefully maintained composure shattered like glass. Jordan had woken up that morning in his Chicago penthouse, staring at the ceiling as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city below was just beginning to stir, but he had been awake for hours, turning over the story in his mind, wondering if he was doing the right thing. On his nightstand sat a photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. The image showed a young boy, maybe 7 years old, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy, a basketball clutched against his chest. That boy's name was Raymond Calloway, and he was the reason Jordan was about to walk into the most powerful office in the world and speak words that would change everything. Raymond had written Jordan a letter exactly 1 year ago, delivered through the labyrinth of fan mail and official correspondence that flowed endlessly into Jordan's various business offices. Most letters were screened by assistants, categorized, and filed away or responded to with form letters and autographed photos. But Raymond's letter had somehow made its way directly to Jordan's personal desk, and when Jordan read it, something inside him cracked open. The boy wrote with the simple honesty that only children possess, describing his life in South Memphis, his dreams of playing basketball, and his fear that those dreams would die before they ever had a chance to breathe. Raymond's father had been killed in a shooting outside a convenience store 3 months earlier, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment. Raymond wrote that he practiced his jump shot against the side of an abandoned building because the local park's basketball court had been closed for 2 years, its hoops torn down, its asphalt cracked and dangerous. But it was Raymond's final paragraph that had stopped Jordan cold, the words searing themselves into his memory with the permanence of a brand. The boy had written that his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, told the class that everyone in America had equal opportunity, that if they worked hard enough, they could achieve anything. Raymond wrote that he wanted to believe Mrs. Patterson, truly wanted to believe it with all his heart. But when he looked around his neighborhood, when he saw the closed schools and shuttered businesses, when he watched his mother cry at night over bills she couldn't pay, he wondered if equal opportunity was just a story adults told to make children feel better about a world that had already decided their fate. Then Raymond asked Jordan a question that haunted him still. If you had grown up in my neighborhood, with my circumstances, would you still have become Michael Jordan? It was the most honest question anyone had ever asked him, cutting through all the mythology and legend that had built up around his name, challenging the comfortable narrative of pure meritocracy that American success stories love to tell. Jordan had sat in his office that day, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, and realized he didn't have an easy answer. He thought about his own childhood, about his parents who had been there every day, about the schools he attended, that had functioning gyms and qualified coaches, about the stability and structure that had allowed his talent to flourish rather than wither. He wondered, truly wondered, if all his determination and work ethic would have been enough if he had been born into Raymond's circumstances, if the runway to his dreams had been as short and cracked as the one Raymond faced. Jordan had done something then that surprised even himself. He went to Memphis. He didn't send a representative or cut a check or organize a publicity event. He rented a car and drove through South Memphis, past the boarded-up storefronts and the houses with sagging porches, until he found Raymond's street. The abandoned building where the boy practiced his shot stood like a tombstone, its walls covered in graffiti, broken glass glittering on the ground like scattered diamonds. Jordan parked and sat there for a long time, watching kids play in the street, their laughter rising above the sound of distant sirens. He saw Raymond emerge from a narrow apartment building, basketball under his arm, and watched the boy set up at his makeshift court. For 45 minutes, Jordan observed this child practice with a focus and determination that would have made any coach proud. Raymond's form wasn't perfect, but his commitment was absolute. He shot from the same spot over and over, adjusting his release, studying the ball's arc, teaching himself through repetition and will. When he finally missed his last shot and the ball rolled into the street, Raymond chased it down and nearly collided with Jordan, who had walked over without the boy noticing. The recognition on Raymond's face was instant and electric, disbelief giving way to pure joy, and then something more complicated, a mixture of hope and heartbreak that no 7-year-old should have to carry. They talked for 2 hours, sitting on the curb as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Raymond told Jordan about his father, about how he had been a good man who worked in construction and never missed Raymond's school events, about how random violence had stolen him away in seconds. He talked about his mother, about how strong she was, how she never complained even though Raymond could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He talked about his dreams of playing basketball, but also about wanting to be a doctor, or maybe an engineer, about how he loved science and building things with his hands. Raymond's mind was hungry, eager, full of potential that was systematically being starved by circumstances beyond his control. Jordan asked him about his school, and Raymond's face darkened. The building was old, he said, with broken windows that let in the cold during winter. His science class didn't have enough textbooks for every student, so they had to share. The library had been closed for budget reasons, its books boxed up and stored somewhere. His math teacher was nice but overwhelmed, trying to help 35 students in a classroom designed for 20. When Jordan asked about the basketball court at the park, Raymond shrugged with the weary acceptance of someone much older. The city had closed it after some kids got hurt on the damaged surface, and there was no money to fix it. There were plans, always plans, Raymond said with the bitter wisdom of experience, but plans didn't put hoops back up or fill cracks in asphalt. Jordan left Memphis that night with a fury burning in his chest, but it was a cold fury, controlled and purposeful. He had spent decades being famous, decades building businesses and brands, decades speaking to audiences about excellence and determination and the pursuit of greatness. But he had never spoken about the fundamental inequality of starting lines, about how America asked some children to run a marathon while others got to drive. He had never acknowledged out loud what he had always known in his heart. That talent without opportunity was like a seed thrown on concrete, capable of growth but given no soil in which to root. For the next year, Jordan had worked quietly, using his resources and connections to dig deep into the reality of Raymond's situation and the situations of millions of children like him. He hired researchers and analysts, sociologists and economists, people who could map the complex web of systemic disadvantages that determined life outcomes before children were old enough to understand what was happening to them. The data they compiled was overwhelming in its clarity and devastating in its implications. Children born in certain zip codes had life expectancies 15 years shorter than children born 10 miles away. Schools in poor neighborhoods received thousands of dollars less per student than schools in wealthy areas. Access to healthcare, nutrition, safe housing, quality education, all of it was determined by accidents of birth, by factors completely outside a child's control. Jordan discovered that Raymond's closed basketball court was part of a larger pattern of recreational facilities being shuttered in poor neighborhoods, while wealthy areas enjoyed pristine parks and sports complexes. He learned that Raymond's underfunded school was one of thousands across America, operating with outdated textbooks, crumbling infrastructure, and teachers who had to buy basic supplies with their own money. He found that Raymond's mother's 2 jobs still left them below the poverty line, trapped in a system where childcare costs consumed nearly half her income and one unexpected medical bill could topple their precarious stability. The more Jordan learned, the angrier he became, but also the more humble. He thought about all the speeches he had given about hard work and dedication, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and he realized how incomplete those messages had been. Hard work mattered, absolutely, but it mattered within a context, within a structure, and that structure was rigged in ways both obvious and subtle. He thought about his famous quote about missing thousands of shots and failing over and over, about how failure was the foundation of success. But that philosophy assumed you had thousands of shots to take, that you had a safe place to fail and the resources to try again. Raymond was living in a world where one mistake could be fatal, where there were no safety nets, where the margin for error was so thin it was practically non-existent. Jordan began to understand that Raymond's question about equal opportunity wasn't just a child's curiosity. It was a profound philosophical challenge to the mythology America told itself. The country loved to celebrate exceptional individuals who overcame adversity, pointing to them as proof that the system worked, that anyone could make it if they tried hard enough. But those exceptional cases often obscured the millions who didn't make it despite working just as hard, despite having equal or greater talent, who were defeated not by lack of character but by the crushing weight of structural disadvantages. Jordan himself was held up as the ultimate example of merit-based success, but he knew his story was more complicated than the legend suggested. Yes, he had worked incredibly hard, had pushed himself beyond normal limits, had cultivated an almost superhuman competitive drive. But he had also been given opportunities at crucial moments, had benefited from coaches who saw his potential and invested time in developing it, had attended a university that gave him visibility and training, had entered a professional system that, while challenging, provided clear pathways to success. What if one of those opportunities had been absent? What if his high school hadn't had a basketball team? What if his family had been so poor that he needed to work full-time instead of practice? What if the neighborhood where he grew up had been so dangerous that going outside to shoot hoops meant risking his life? These questions haunted Jordan as he compiled his research, as he built the case he would present to President Chen. He visited dozens of communities like Raymond's, walked through neglected neighborhoods, sat in underfunded classrooms, talked to parents who worked multiple jobs and still couldn't provide their children with basic security. He met kids with dreams as big as his once were, with talent and hunger and potential, who were being systematically failed by a society that claimed to value merit while rigging the game from birth. Jordan started to see his own success differently, not as invalidated but as contextual, as the product not just of his individual excellence but of a complex interaction between his abilities and the opportunities he had been given. He didn't feel guilty about his success. He had earned it through genuine effort and sacrifice, but he felt responsible for acknowledging the full truth of it, for using his platform to speak about the parts of the story that made people uncomfortable. The myth of the self-made man was seductive and empowering, but it was also dangerous because it let society off the hook, allowed people to ignore systemic injustice by focusing on individual exceptions. Jordan knew that speaking this truth publicly would be controversial. Many people, including some who looked like him and came from similar backgrounds, had built their entire worldviews around the idea that America was fundamentally fair, that success was purely a function of merit, that anyone complaining about inequality was making excuses or looking for handouts. Jordan understood that impulse. He had felt it himself for years, had resisted any suggestion that his achievements were anything other than the result of his own determination. But Raymond's letter had cracked that certainty, had forced him to look more carefully at the world beyond his own exceptional experience. Jordan realized that believing in personal responsibility and acknowledging systemic inequality weren't contradictory positions. They were both true simultaneously. parts of a more complex and honest understanding of how success actually worked. He could honor his own hard work while also recognizing that hard work alone wasn't enough, that the playing field was tilted in ways that made some journeys exponentially harder than others. 6 months before his meeting with President Chen, Jordan had started the Raymond Callaway Foundation, named after the boy whose letter had changed everything. The foundation's mission was different from typical charitable organizations. Instead of providing temporary relief or feel-good programs, Jordan wanted to address root causes, to change systems rather than just help individuals navigate broken systems. He recruited experts in education, urban development, public health, and criminal justice reform. He partnered with researchers who had been studying inequality for decades, who had data and solutions that never got implemented because they lacked political will and public support. The foundation began working in South Memphis and 5 other communities across America, investing in comprehensive approaches that addressed multiple disadvantages simultaneously. They renovated schools and provided resources for teachers. They created job training programs and helped parents access better employment. They established community health centers and subsidized healthy food options. They rebuilt parks and recreational facilities, including basketball courts, because children needed places to play and dream safely. But Jordan knew that private charity, no matter how well-funded or well-intentioned, couldn't solve problems that required massive public investment. The scope of inequality in America was too vast, too deeply embedded in policies and structures to be addressed by foundations and nonprofits alone. Fixing it required government action, required policy changes, required a national commitment to actually providing the equal opportunity that the country claimed as its founding principle. That realization had led Jordan to request this meeting with President Chen. The president had a reputation as a pragmatist, someone who valued data over ideology, who had risen through local and state politics by focusing on practical solutions to concrete problems. He had been elected on a platform of economic renewal and had spent his first 2 years in office navigating complex international challenges and domestic political gridlock. Jordan had supported Chen's campaign with both donations and public endorsements, believing the man represented a break from the partisan paralysis that had dominated Washington for decades. But Jordan had never leveraged that support, had never asked for anything in return, had maintained a respectful distance from direct political involvement. Until now. Until Raymond's question had become too urgent to ignore. Until Jordan had spent a year seeing with his own eyes the children being left behind. Until he had compiled evidence so overwhelming that staying silent felt like complicity. Jordan had called the White House 3 weeks ago, speaking directly to the president's chief of staff, asking for a private meeting with no press, no publicity, just a conversation between 2 men about the country's future. The chief of staff had been curious but accommodating, and President Chen had personally confirmed the meeting, telling Jordan he was always interested in hearing from thoughtful people with perspectives beyond the usual Washington echo chamber. Now Jordan sat in the Oval Office, his briefcase open on the chair beside him, his hands resting calmly on his knees despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. President Chen had offered coffee, which Jordan accepted, and they had spent the first 10 minutes in small talk discussing the upcoming basketball season, the president's recent trip to negotiate trade agreements in Asia, the weather turning colder as November approached. Jordan appreciated the warmth of the greeting, the president's genuine friendliness, but he could sense Chen's curiosity growing, the subtle shift in posture that indicated readiness to address the real purpose of the meeting. Jordan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thin folder, placing it on the president's desk. Inside was Raymond's original letter, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve, the boy's handwriting showing the careful loops and lines of someone still mastering cursive. Jordan slid the folder across the polished wood surface and watched as President Chen opened it, his eyes scanning the page. The president read slowly, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention, and then to something deeper, something that looked like recognition or perhaps pain. When Chen finished reading, he looked up at Jordan, and the basketball legend saw that the president's eyes had grown bright, emotional in a way that surprised them both. Jordan began to speak, his voice steady but charged with conviction. He told the president about visiting Memphis, about watching Raymond practice basketball against the side of an abandoned building, about the conversations that had followed. He described the year of research, the data his foundation had compiled, the communities he had visited, the children he had met who were every bit as talented and hardworking as Jordan himself had been at their age, but who faced obstacles that would likely defeat them before they reached adulthood. Jordan spoke about the closed basketball court and what it represented. Not just a recreational facility, but a symbol of how America had given up on certain communities, had accepted that some children's potential would be wasted, that inequality was inevitable or even justified. He talked about the underfunded schools where teachers performed miracles daily, with resources that would be considered unacceptable in wealthy districts, about the healthcare deserts where treatable conditions became chronic or fatal, about the food deserts where fresh produce was a luxury, about the lack of safe spaces where children could simply be children. Jordan presented statistics showing how zip codes predicted life outcomes with frightening accuracy, how the circumstances of birth determined whether a child would graduate from high school, attend college, avoid incarceration, live past 50. He showed President Chen maps of his own city, highlighting how resources flowed to some neighborhoods while others were systematically drained, how public investment followed property values, creating self-reinforcing cycles of advantage and disadvantage. President Chen listened without interrupting, his attention absolute, his expression growing more troubled as Jordan continued. The basketball legend could see the president processing the information, recognizing patterns, making connections. Chen had come from modest circumstances himself, had worked his way through state universities, had built his political career on understanding policy details and demographic realities. He wasn't naive about inequality, but Jordan suspected he had never seen it presented this comprehensively, this personally, by someone with Jordan's credibility and platform. Jordan explained that he wasn't asking for simple solutions or quick fixes, wasn't naive enough to think that complex problems built over generations could be solved with a single speech or policy initiative. But he was asking the president to make this issue a central priority, to use the power of his office to shift the national conversation, to propose comprehensive policies that actually addressed root causes rather than just treating symptoms. Jordan outlined specific recommendations that his foundation's researchers had developed. Massive increases in funding for schools in poor districts, tied to outcomes rather than property taxes. Universal pre-kindergarten programs that gave every child the same strong start, regardless of parental income. Affordable housing initiatives that broke up concentrations of poverty. Job training and employment programs that provided pathways to middle-class stability. Criminal justice reforms that stopped filling prisons with nonviolent offenders and tearing apart families. Healthcare policies that ensured every child had access to preventive care and treatment. Infrastructure investments in neglected communities that signaled they hadn't been forgotten. The president listened to everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions, sometimes making notes on a pad he kept on his desk. When Jordan finished his formal presentation, Chen sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face, clearly thinking deeply about what he had heard. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with the weight of what was being considered. Finally, President Chen spoke, his voice thoughtful and measured. He told Jordan that he appreciated the presentation, that the research was impressive, that the foundation's work in South Memphis and other communities was admirable. He acknowledged that inequality was a serious problem, that too many children didn't have genuine opportunities, that America needed to do better. But then Chen's tone shifted slightly, becoming more political, more careful. He talked about budget constraints and political realities, about the difficulty of passing major legislation in a divided Congress, about the many competing priorities demanding attention and resources. He mentioned the need to maintain economic growth, the concerns about expanding government programs, the resistance from taxpayers who felt they were already overburdened. The president spoke about incremental progress in building coalitions, about the art of the possible and the dangers of overreaching. Jordan felt his frustration rising as he listened to the familiar language of political caution, the instinctive retreat into conventional wisdom and safe positions. When President Chen finished explaining all the reasons why comprehensive action was difficult, Jordan did something unexpected. He stood up from his chair, walked to the famous windows overlooking the Rose Garden, and stood there for a long moment with his back to the president. The Secret Service agents stationed at the room's periphery tensed slightly, uncertain about the movement, but Chen waved them off, curious about what Jordan was doing. The basketball legend stared out at the manicured gardens, at the carefully maintained beauty of this historic space, and thought about Raymond practicing his jump shot against a crumbling wall in South Memphis. He thought about all the children across America who would go to bed tonight in homes without enough heat or food, who would wake up tomorrow to attend schools that had given up on them, who would spend their lives running a race they had lost before it started. Jordan thought about his own legacy, about how he would be remembered, about whether being the greatest basketball player of all time was enough when he had the power and platform to fight for something more important. Then he turned back to face President Chen, and the expression on Jordan's face was unlike anything the president had ever seen. Fierce and determined, but also vulnerable and sincere. Jordan began to speak again, but his tone had changed. He told the president a story he had never shared publicly, about a night during his sophomore year of high school when he had been cut from the varsity basketball team. Everyone knew that story. It was part of the Jordan mythology, the setback that fueled his legendary work ethic. But what people didn't know was what happened after that cut, in the hours when Jordan went home devastated, questioning whether his dreams were realistic, whether he had the talent to make it. His father had found him sitting alone in their backyard, tears streaming down his face, and instead of offering easy comfort or dismissing his pain, James Jordan had sat down beside his son and told him something that Michael had carried with him ever since. His father had said that disappointment was going to be a constant companion in life, that doors would close and opportunities would be denied, but that the true measure of a person was how they responded when the world said no. Then his father had said something even more important. He told Michael that he was lucky, truly lucky, because even though he had been cut from one team, he still had a safe home, parents who loved him, a school that would give him another chance, a community that would support his development. James Jordan told his son that millions of kids in America had more talent, more hunger, more determination than Michael did, but they would never get the chance to prove it because they didn't have the foundation, the support system, the basic security that made it possible to pursue dreams. Jordan told President Chen that his father's words had haunted him throughout his career. Every time he succeeded, every time he won a championship or earned an award or broke a record, he thought about all the kids who might have stood where he was standing if they had been given the same chances. He thought about the Raymond Callaways of the world, born with gifts they would never get to unwrap because society had decided their potential wasn't worth investing in. Jordan told the president that for years he had pushed those thoughts aside, had focused on his own journey, had told himself that his success was his own and that everyone had to be responsible for their own path. But Raymond's letter had shattered that comfortable distance, had forced him to confront the reality that American opportunity was largely a myth, that the playing field wasn't level and never had been, that the country was systematically wasting human potential on a massive scale. Jordan's voice grew more intense as he spoke about visiting communities where children's dreams died before adolescence, where talented kids ended up in prisons or graves instead of colleges or careers, where the accident of birthplace determined destiny with the certainty of fate. He talked about meeting mothers who worked multiple jobs and still couldn't provide their children with basic stability, about seeing schools that looked like prisons, and prisons that were filled with people who had never been given real alternatives. Then Jordan made his voice softer, but no less powerful. He told President Chen that he understood political realities, understood that change was hard, understood that Congress was difficult and budgets were tight, and interest groups were powerful. He acknowledged all of that, accepted it as the complex reality of governing in a democracy. But then Jordan said something that made the president lean forward in his chair, that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. He told Chen that he knew about Riverside, knew what had happened 23 years ago, knew the truth that the president had buried so deeply that he probably thought no one would ever uncover it. Jordan watched as the color drained from President Chen's face, as the practiced political composure crumbled into something raw and real. The president's hands gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jordan had rendered the most powerful man in the country completely speechless, and he hadn't even revealed what he knew yet, hadn't explained how this secret connected to Raymond's question about equal opportunity. Riverside had been a small community in the Central Valley of California, a place most Americans had never heard of and never would. 23 years ago, when Marcus Chen was a young state assemblyman representing a district that included Riverside, the community had been struggling with economic decline, with the closure of manufacturing plants that had sustained families for generations, with rising poverty and crime as opportunities disappeared. Chen had been an ambitious politician, smart and capable. Someone who genuinely cared about policy, but who also understood that political survival required making strategic choices, required prioritizing some constituents over others, required sometimes sacrificing principle for pragmatism. A crisis had emerged in Riverside when the state announced plans to close the community's only public hospital due to budget shortfalls. The hospital wasn't profitable, served mostly poor patients, and the state argued that consolidating services at larger facilities would save money and improve efficiency. The community had fought back, organizing protests and petition drives, and they had turned to their assemblyman, Marcus Chen, to save their hospital. Chen had been sympathetic but calculating. Saving the hospital would require him to fight his own party's governor, would make powerful enemies, would potentially derail his rising political career. At the same time, a wealthy developer in a different part of Chen's district was proposing a major commercial development that would bring jobs and tax revenue, but required state approvals and zoning changes that Chen could facilitate. The choice Chen faced was clear: fight for the hospital and risk his political future, or let it close while supporting the commercial development that would benefit his career and the wealthier part of his district. Chen had made what he considered a pragmatic decision. He didn't oppose the hospital closure directly, but didn't fight for it either, letting it happen while he used his political capital to help the commercial development succeed. The hospital closed, and people in Riverside died who might have lived if they had access to emergency care. Chen's political career flourished, and he eventually became governor and then president, always maintaining his reputation as a thoughtful pragmatist who focused on practical solutions rather than ideological purity. But he had carried the weight of Riverside with him, had known that his calculation had cost lives, had tried to make up for it through other policies and programs that helped poor communities. He had never spoken about it publicly, had buried it deep in his conscience, had told himself that you couldn't save everyone, that politics required difficult choices, that overall he had done more good than harm. No one had ever connected his decision about Riverside to his later political success. No one had uncovered the secret calculation that had helped build his career, until Jordan's researchers had found it. Jordan's foundation had been investigating patterns of healthcare access in poor communities, and they had stumbled across the Riverside Hospital closure in their research. At first, it was just another data point, another example of how essential services disappeared from low-income areas while wealthy communities thrived. But then one of Jordan's researchers had noticed that Marcus Chen had been the state assemblyman for that district, and she had dug deeper, tracking down meeting minutes and correspondence, interviewing former staff members and community activists. What emerged was a clear picture of Chen's calculation, of how he had chosen political advancement over community welfare, of how the hospital closure had fit into a broader pattern of resources flowing away from places like Riverside toward wealthier communities. The researcher had brought the information to Jordan, uncertain whether it was relevant to the Foundation's work or just political history. Jordan had read through everything carefully, had verified the facts independently, and had recognized immediately that he was holding a secret that could destroy President Chen's reputation if it became public. The revelation that the president had essentially traded lives for political advancement would be devastating, would taint his entire career, would potentially force his resignation or at least cripple his effectiveness. Jordan had spent weeks wrestling with what to do with the information. He wasn't interested in destroying Chen's career for revenge or political gain, wasn't looking to blackmail or threaten the president. But he recognized that the Riverside decision was directly relevant to Raymond's question about equal opportunity, was a stark example of how political leaders made choices that systematically disadvantaged poor communities while benefiting wealthy ones. The hospital closure wasn't the result of natural market forces or inevitable budget constraints. It was the result of Chen choosing to prioritize one group of constituents over another, choosing to let poor people suffer so that wealthy people could prosper and his own career could advance. Jordan realized that this secret wasn't just about exposing Chen's past. It was about forcing the president to confront the consequences of the political calculations that perpetuated inequality, about making him see that his supposedly pragmatic decisions had real costs in human lives and potential. Jordan decided that he would share the information with Chen privately, would use it not as a threat but as a mirror, asking the president to look honestly at how his choices had contributed to the systemic problems he now claimed to care about solving. Now, with Chen speechless and shaken, Jordan walked back to his chair and sat down. He spoke gently, without malice or judgment, explaining how his researchers had uncovered the Riverside story, making clear that he had no intention of making it public, that he wasn't there to threaten or blackmail the president. Jordan said that he had shared this information for one reason only: to help Chen understand that the decisions political leaders made, the priorities they chose, the groups they favored or abandoned, created the inequality that children like Raymond inherited. The hospital closure in Riverside was connected to every child who died from treatable conditions because they lived in a healthcare desert, to every family that went bankrupt from medical bills, to every community that watched essential services disappear while wealthy areas accumulated resources. Chen's calculation 23 years ago was just one small decision, but it was emblematic of thousands of similar calculations made by political leaders at every level, creating and perpetuating a system where opportunity was distributed by zip code and circumstance rather than merit. Jordan told the president that he was sharing this not to punish him for the past, but to challenge him about the future, to ask whether he was willing to make different choices now, whether he was ready to prioritize equality of opportunity over political expediency, whether he could transform his past failure into present courage. President Chen sat frozen in his chair, his face a mixture of shame and pain and something that looked like relief. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told Jordan that he had thought about Riverside every day for 23 years, that the faces of the people he had failed haunted his dreams, that he had tried to make amends through his later policies but had always known it wasn't enough. Chen said that he had justified his decision by telling himself that he could do more good by staying in politics than by sacrificing his career over one hospital, that sometimes you had to accept losses to achieve larger victories. But he admitted that was largely rationalization, that the truth was simpler and more selfish. He had been ambitious and scared, had wanted to succeed more than he wanted to do the right thing, had made a calculation that prioritized his own future over other people's lives. The president's eyes filled with tears as he talked about how he had built his entire political career on that compromise, how every success he had achieved was shadowed by the knowledge of what he had traded away to get there. Chen told Jordan that he had spent years trying to figure out how to use his power to help communities like Riverside without destroying his political viability, trying to balance his genuine desire to make things better with the practical necessity of maintaining support from wealthy donors and powerful interests. Then President Chen said something that surprised Jordan. He told the basketball legend that he was grateful for this conversation, grateful to finally talk honestly about the calculation that had defined his career, grateful to be challenged rather than enabled or excused. Chen said that Jordan was right, that the Riverside decision was connected to Raymond's question, that the two situations were mirror images of the same fundamental problem. America claimed to offer equal opportunity while systematically denying it, while making choices that ensured some children would thrive and others would fail regardless of their individual merit. The president stood up from his desk and walked to the same windows where Jordan had stood earlier, looking out at the rose garden with its carefully maintained perfection. He said that he had spent his presidency trying to navigate between competing interests, trying to achieve incremental progress while avoiding political disasters, trying to help without alienating the powerful constituencies whose support he needed to stay in office. But Jordan's presentation and the revelation about Riverside had crystallized something for him, had made him realize that incrementalism and calculation had their own costs, that trying to maintain political viability by never taking real risks meant perpetuating the systems that created inequality. Chen turned back to Jordan with an expression that was both determined and afraid, and he said something that would change both their lives. The president told Jordan that he was going to do something unprecedented, something his advisors would call political suicide, something that might destroy his presidency, but that he had to do anyway. Chen said he was going to give a national address in which he would tell the truth about Riverside, about the calculation he had made as a young politician, about how that decision had helped build his career while contributing to the systemic abandonment of poor communities. He would use his own failure as a case study in how political leaders perpetuated inequality through supposedly pragmatic choices, how the accumulation of thousands of similar decisions created the reality that children like Raymond faced. Then Chen said he would propose the most comprehensive equality agenda any president had ever advanced, going far beyond anything Jordan had suggested, committing the full power of his office to actually creating the equal opportunity America claimed to provide. The president acknowledged that this would likely end his political career, that telling the truth about Riverside and proposing such aggressive policies would alienate donors, anger powerful interests, and make him unelectable in the next cycle. But Chen said that Jordan had made him realize that he had been carrying the weight of Riverside for 2 decades, had been trying to justify his past choices through later actions, and that the only way forward was to stop calculating and start fighting. To use whatever power he had remaining to push for real change even if it cost him everything. Jordan felt something shift in his chest as he listened to the president, a mixture of admiration and fear and hope. He told Chen that he hadn't come here expecting this, that he had hoped to push the president toward bolder policies but hadn't imagined he would confess to Riverside publicly or propose such comprehensive reforms. Jordan warned that the political consequences would be severe, that Chen's enemies would destroy him, that even his allies might abandon him, that this decision could make him a one-term president and taint his legacy forever. But even as Jordan outlined these risks, he could see the determination settling into Chen's features, the fear being replaced by something that looked like liberation. The president said that he was tired of being haunted, tired of making calculations that prioritize political survival over moral responsibility. Tired of knowing that children like Raymond were suffering while he focused on maintaining his approval ratings and pleasing donors. Chen said that Jordan's question about whether he would have become Michael Jordan if he had grown up in Raymond's circumstances had challenged the president to ask himself a similar question. Would he have become president if he had made the right choice about Riverside, if he had fought for that hospital and sacrificed his political career 23 years ago? The answer was probably no, which meant his presidency was built on a foundation of compromised values, which meant every accomplishment was tainted by that original calculation. President Chen told Jordan that he had about 18 months left in his term, that he wasn't running for re-election anyway because he had privately decided to serve only 1 term, and that he wanted to use that time to push as hard as he could for genuine change. He would propose legislation that addressed every issue Jordan had raised: education funding reform, universal pre-kindergarten, affordable housing, healthcare access, criminal justice reform, infrastructure investment in neglected communities. He would use executive orders where Congress blocked him, would fight with every tool available, would make this his singular focus for the remainder of his presidency. Chen acknowledged that much of what he proposed wouldn't pass, that the opposition would be fierce, that he might accomplish only a fraction of his agenda. But he said that sometimes the value of a political fight wasn't in immediate victory but in changing the terms of debate, in making people confront uncomfortable truths, in building a foundation that future leaders could build upon. The president wanted to force the country to answer Raymond's question honestly, to admit that equal opportunity was largely a myth, to begin the difficult work of actually creating the level playing field that America claimed already existed. Jordan felt overwhelmed by what was happening, by the weight of what he had set in motion. He had come here hoping to push a president toward better policies, and instead, he had triggered what could be a political transformation or catastrophe. He told Chen that he would support him completely, would use his platform to amplify the president's message, would mobilize his foundation's resources behind the reform agenda. Jordan said that he would also work to protect Chen from some of the fallout, would help frame the Riverside Confession not as a disqualifying failure, but as an example of the honesty and courage needed to address systemic problems. But Jordan also made clear that the president couldn't depend on one celebrity endorsement, that this fight would require building a coalition of activists, community leaders, policy experts, and ordinary citizens who understood that the current system was failing millions of children. Chen nodded, accepting that his decision would be difficult and costly, but also expressing a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The president said that Jordan had given him a gift, had forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding, had offered him a chance at redemption even if that redemption came at the cost of his political future. As their meeting approached its conclusion, Jordan reached into his briefcase one more time and withdrew a photograph. It was the same image that had been sitting on his nightstand that morning. Raymond Calloway at age 7, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy, basketball clutched against his chest. Jordan placed the photograph on President Chen's desk and told him that this should be the last thing the president looked at every night and the first thing he saw every morning, a reminder of why they were fighting and who they were fighting for. Raymond represented millions of children whose potential was being wasted, whose dreams were dying before they had a chance to breathe, whose opportunities were determined by circumstances they couldn't control. Jordan told Chen that Raymond was now 8 years old, that he was still practicing his jump shot, that his mother was still working 2 jobs, that his school was still underfunded and his neighborhood was still neglected. Every day that politicians chose calculation over courage, children like Raymond paid the price, lost ground they could never recover, had doors closed that would never reopen. Jordan said that the president's decision to tell the truth about Riverside and fight for comprehensive reform wouldn't solve Raymond's problems overnight, wouldn't instantly create equal opportunity for every child in America. But it would be a start, a signal that at least one person with power was willing to prioritize children over political survival, willing to risk everything to fight for what was right. President Chen picked up the photograph and stared at it for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. He told Jordan that he would keep his promise, that Raymond's face would be the last thing he saw before bed and the first thing he saw each morning. Then the president asked Jordan to arrange for him to visit South Memphis, to meet Raymond personally, to see the community and the challenges firsthand. Chen said he wanted to launch his reform agenda from there, wanted to give his speech about Riverside standing in the neighborhood where Raymond lived, wanted to make the connection explicit between his past failure and his current commitment. The president said he would invite Raymond to stand beside him during the speech, would tell the country that this child and millions like him were the reason America needed to stop making excuses and start making changes. Jordan agreed to arrange the visit, feeling a mixture of pride and terror about what was about to unfold. He knew that the reaction would be fierce, that Chen's enemies would attack him viciously, that even supporters would question his judgment and tactics. But Jordan also knew that sometimes transformation required disruption, that breaking unjust systems meant accepting short-term chaos for long-term progress, that the only way to create real change was to force people to confront uncomfortable truths. As Jordan prepared to leave the Oval Office, President Chen extended his hand again, but this time the gesture felt different. Not the practiced political handshake of their greeting, but something more personal and profound, a moment of recognition between 2 men who had been changed by their conversation. Chen thanked Jordan for his courage in bringing this challenge to him, for uncovering the truth about Riverside, for asking questions that had no easy answers, for refusing to accept the status quo just because it was comfortable or politically convenient. The president said that Jordan had done something extraordinary by using his platform not for personal gain or shallow advocacy, but for forcing a reckoning with systemic injustice, for demanding that America live up to its stated values rather than just paying them lip service. Jordan thanked the president for his honesty and for his commitment to fight, acknowledging that Chen was taking enormous personal and political risks, that the decision to expose his own past failures required a level of courage that was rare in public life. They both understood that the coming months would be difficult, that the opposition would be relentless, that failure was possible or even likely. But they also understood that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds, that some truths needed to be spoken even when they were costly, that Raymond's question about equal opportunity deserved more than comfortable evasions or incremental gestures. Jordan left the White House that afternoon with the autumn sun still painting long shadows across the rose garden, with the weight of what had transpired pressing against his ribs like a stone, but also with a sense of purpose more powerful than anything he had felt during his playing career. He thought about all the championships he had won, all the records he had broken, all the moments of athletic brilliance that had defined his public life. Those achievements were real and meaningful, had brought joy to millions of people, had demonstrated what human potential could accomplish through dedication and will. But as Jordan walked to his car, past the Secret Service agents who nodded respectfully, past the tourists taking photographs through the iron fence, past the monuments to past presidents who had grappled with their own versions of these questions, he realized that his conversation with President Chen might be more important than any game he had ever played. Raymond's letter had asked whether Jordan would have become Michael Jordan if he had been born into different circumstances, and Jordan had been forced to admit the uncomfortable truth. Probably not. That his success was the product not just of his individual excellence, but of opportunities and advantages that millions of equally talented children never received. That truth didn't diminish Jordan's achievements, didn't mean he hadn't earned his success through genuine effort and sacrifice. But it did mean that his success carried responsibilities, required him to use his platform and resources to fight for children who would never get the chances he had been given. 3 weeks later, President Marcus Chen stood in South Memphis, Raymond Calloway beside him on a temporary stage erected in the same lot where the boy practiced his jump shot against an abandoned building. News cameras from around the world captured the moment as Chen began the most remarkable speech any sitting president had ever delivered, confessing to his failure in Riverside 23 years earlier, explaining how that calculation had helped build his political career while contributing to the abandonment of communities like this one. The president's voice cracked with emotion as he told Raymond's story, as he read portions of the boy's letter to Jordan, as he challenged America to finally answer the question honestly. Did the country actually provide equal opportunity? Or was that just a comforting myth that allowed people to ignore systemic injustice? Chen laid out his comprehensive reform agenda, committing to fight for every policy that Jordan had suggested and more, acknowledging that much of it would face fierce opposition, that he might accomplish only a fraction of what he proposed. But the president said that the fight itself mattered, that forcing the country to confront its failures was necessary, even if immediate victory proved elusive, that Raymond and millions of children like him deserved leaders who would risk everything to create genuine opportunity rather than just talk about it. The reaction was exactly as fierce as Jordan had anticipated. Chen's political opponents attacked him ruthlessly, calling him unfit for office, demanding his resignation, arguing that his confession about Riverside proved he had never deserved the presidency. Some of his own party abandoned him, worried about the political costs of association, concerned that his radical agenda would hurt their own electoral prospects. Editorial pages debated whether a president could survive such brutal honesty, whether leadership required the kind of calculation Chen had repudiated, whether his reform proposals were visionary or reckless. But something unexpected happened amid the criticism and chaos. Millions of ordinary Americans responded to Chen's speech with gratitude and hope, thanking him for telling the truth, for acknowledging what they had always known about inequality, for finally proposing policies that matched the scale of the problem. Community organizers and activists mobilized behind the president's agenda, creating pressure on reluctant legislators, building coalitions that crossed traditional partisan lines. Parents in struggling neighborhoods saw their children's lives reflected in Raymond's story, recognized that their circumstances weren't the result of personal failures but of systemic choices that could be changed with sufficient political will. Even some political moderates who had initially criticized Chen's confession began to acknowledge that his honesty was refreshing, that his willingness to sacrifice his political future for principle was precisely the kind of leadership the country needed. Jordan threw himself completely into supporting the president's agenda. He gave speeches across the country, using his platform to amplify Chen's message, sharing stories from the communities his foundation served, challenging Americans to decide whether they truly believed in equal opportunity or were content with comfortable myths. He produced documentaries showing the realities of childhood poverty and systemic disadvantage, making the abstract concrete, giving faces and names to the statistics. Jordan lobbied legislators personally, using both his celebrity and his carefully marshaled facts to argue for specific reforms, refusing to accept political excuses or pragmatic calculations. He organized other athletes and celebrities behind the cause, building a coalition that brought visibility and resources to the fight. Most importantly, Jordan kept Raymond's story at the center of everything, ensuring that the debate never became abstract or theoretical, that people remembered the actual child whose question had started this transformation. Raymond himself became a symbol of potential threatened by circumstance, his intelligence and determination evident to everyone who met him, his reality disproving any comfortable narratives about merit determining outcomes. The legislative battles lasted for the remainder of Chen's presidency, and the results were mixed. Some reforms passed, particularly those focused on education funding and criminal justice, creating real improvements for millions of children. Other proposals died in Congress, blocked by opposition from wealthy interests and ideological resistance to government programs. Executive orders accomplished some goals, but faced legal challenges that would take years to resolve. The comprehensive transformation that Jordan and Chen had hoped for remained incomplete, a work in progress that would require continued fighting by future leaders and activists. But something fundamental had shifted in the national conversation. Raymond's question about whether America truly provided equal opportunity had been forced into the public consciousness in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The comfortable myth of pure meritocracy had been challenged, complicated by the reality that starting lines were profoundly unequal. That talent without opportunity was like a seed thrown on concrete. Millions of Americans who had benefited from advantages they hadn't earned began to acknowledge their luck, to recognize that their success wasn't purely individual, to accept responsibility for creating systems that actually provided the opportunities they had been given. President Chen's approval ratings never recovered from the Riverside Confession and his aggressive reform agenda. He left office with historians divided about his legacy, some calling him the most honest and courageous president in modern history, others arguing that his abandonment of political calculation had squandered opportunities for incremental progress. But Chen himself seemed at peace with his choices, unburdened by the weight of Riverside for the first time in 23 years, satisfied that he had finally chosen principle over pragmatism, even at enormous personal cost. In his farewell address, Chen thanked Jordan for challenging him, thanked Raymond for asking the question that changed everything, thanked the millions of Americans who had supported the fight even when victory seemed unlikely. The president said that true leadership wasn't about maintaining power through calculation and compromise. It was about using power to fight for what was right, even when that fight was costly, about being willing to sacrifice political survival for moral responsibility, about answering difficult questions honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable. Raymond Calloway, now 9 years old, stood beside Jordan at President Chen's farewell address, having become an unlikely symbol of America's unfinished work toward equal opportunity. His neighborhood still faced enormous challenges. His school still needed resources. His mother still worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. But Raymond's basketball court had been rebuilt. His classrooms had new textbooks. His community health center had reopened. And most importantly, millions of people now knew his name and his story, knew that his question demanded an answer, knew that America couldn't claim to be a land of opportunity while systematically denying opportunities to children like him. Raymond told a reporter that he still wanted to play professional basketball someday, but he also wanted to be an engineer, wanted to build things that helped people, wanted to make sure other kids didn't have to practice their jump shots against abandoned buildings because their communities had been forgotten. When the reporter asked if he still believed what his teacher had told him about everyone having equal opportunity in America, Raymond thought carefully before answering. He said that he believed America could provide equal opportunity if enough people fought for it. If leaders were willing to tell the truth about inequality rather than pretending it didn't exist. If citizens demanded that the country actually live up to its stated values. But Raymond said he also knew that opportunity wasn't equal yet, that his circumstances were harder than those of kids born in wealthy neighborhoods, that his talent and hard work might not be enough to overcome systemic disadvantages. The difference now was that people were finally talking about it honestly, finally acknowledging the truth, finally fighting to create the level playing field that should have existed all along. Michael Jordan continued his foundation's work long after Chen left office, using the momentum from their shared fight to push for continued reforms, to hold future leaders accountable, to keep Raymond's question alive in the national consciousness. Jordan's own legacy transformed in ways he had never anticipated. his athletic achievements now accompanied by recognition for using his platform to challenge systemic injustice, for refusing to accept comfortable myths about meritocracy, for demanding that America answer honestly whether it truly provided equal opportunity. People asked Jordan if he regretted getting involved in such a controversial political fight, if he wished he had maintained the apolitical image that protected his commercial appeal. Jordan always answered the same way. He wished he had asked Raymond's question himself decades earlier, wished he had challenged the mythology of pure meritocracy while he was still playing, wished he had recognized sooner that his success carried responsibilities beyond athletic excellence. But Jordan also said that Raymond's letter had given him a gift, had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, had provided him with a purpose more meaningful than any championship ring. When people told Jordan that his conversation with President Chen had changed American politics, had shifted national debates about inequality, had inspired new generations of activists and reformers, he always redirected the credit to Raymond, to the boy whose honest question had started everything, whose face reminded everyone why the fight mattered. The truth that Michael Jordan walked into the White House and rendered the president speechless wasn't just about revealing Chen's past failure in Riverside, or proposing comprehensive reforms, or challenging comfortable myths about opportunity. It was about the power of one child's honest question to crack open carefully constructed rationalizations, to force people in positions of privilege and power to acknowledge uncomfortable realities, to demand that America either live up to its stated values or admit it had been lying all along. Raymond's question about whether Jordan would have become Michael Jordan if he had been born into different circumstances was devastating precisely because it had no satisfying answer, because it revealed that success in America was determined as much by accidents of birth as by individual merit. Because it challenged the foundational mythology that allowed inequality to persist. Jordan's genius was recognizing that this question needed to be asked not just of him, but of everyone, especially of political leaders who made choices that perpetuated systemic disadvantages. By bringing that question to President Chen, by forcing the president to confront his own calculations and compromises, by refusing to accept political excuses or pragmatic rationalizations, Jordan had done something more significant than winning basketball games. He had used his platform to fight for children he would never meet, to challenge systems that would outlast him, to plant seeds that might take generations to fully bloom. That fight was still ongoing, still incomplete, still facing enormous obstacles and resistance. But it was happening, finally. Because one child had asked an honest question, because one athlete had refused to let that question be ignored, and because one president had been brave enough to answer truthfully, even when the truth cost him everything. So where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Together we can spread kindness and important messages like Raymond's question to people all around the world. And hey, don't go anywhere yet because there's another incredible story waiting for you on the screen right now that you absolutely need to hear. Click on it and let's keep this journey going together.